I'm Andrew Rawnsley, and you're listening to a special edition of the Westminster Hour. On this last Sunday of the century, we'll be deciding who was the Prime Minister of the century. Our electorate is 20 leading historians, commentators and politicians who've been asked to rank the leaders of the 20th century from least to greatest. I should declare an interest. I'm one of the voters. And with me to discuss the contenders are 5 distinguished members of our electorate. Roy Jenkins has been Chancellor, Home Secretary, President of the European Commission and founded the SDP. His prodigious and acclaimed writing includes biographies of Asquith and Attlee, 2 of the Prime Ministers we'll be discussing. Kenneth Baker observed 3 Conservative Prime Ministers from the inside as an aide to Ted Heath and a Cabinet Minister under Margaret Thatcher and John Major. He's authored an extremely jolly cartoon history of our Prime Ministers. Barbara Castle became a Labour MP in Attlee's 1945 landslide and was a Cabinet Minister in the governments of Harold Wilson. Her diaries are relished for their candid and sometimes cutting accounts of life at the centre of power. Andrew Roberts' highly praised Tory histories include eminent Churchillians. His recent biography of Lord Salisbury, the century's first Prime Minister, is dedicated to Margaret Thatcher, thrice elected illiberal Tory, which may give a clue to his political bearings. Professor Ben Pimlott is Warden of Goldsmiths College in London. His greatly admired work includes a biography of the Queen and what's regarded as the definitive life of Harold Wilson. First, the essential question, what makes a great Prime Minister? Roy Jenkins.
Well, I think a necessary but not a sufficient qualification is a good period in office. There is no one with a serious claim to be a great Prime Minister who hadn't served 5 years in number 10 Downing Street. But it's not sufficient, as Lord Liverpool, not in this century but in the last century, showed. Secondly, I would say that under your government there was some important change which left an imprint on the future direction of the country. And third, if you can have a third as well, is to be the dominant personality of your government and perceived as such both by the public and by our colleagues.
Ken Baker, what qualities do you think we're looking for in a great Prime Minister?
Durability of achievement, that what they've done doesn't disappear within a few years after they've ceased being Prime Minister. And I think the great ones do that. And they've also got to have an impact, in the Churchillian phrase he describes of Joe Chamberlain. Joe Chamberlain made the political weather. A great Prime Minister has to make the political weather. And the third thing I'd say is that they had to have style. Style is not sufficient in itself, but we remember our great Prime Ministers for perhaps their eloquence, their character, certain events which would define them as people in the public eye. And if that's missing, then they're not really in the great realm.
Barbara Castle, what do you think makes a great Prime Minister?
Whether they have an enduring impact on the social and political thinking of the country. This point in the century is a good moment in which to look back and decide which of the... Because, look, let's be honest, the greatest is a category that nobody can really fill, because everybody has some weakness and some very ungreatness in them, and probably a weak point in their administration. But if we look back and say, who has left an enduring mark on our thinking, that I think is the definition.
Andrew Roberts, what are you looking for in making the decision?
Well, I think all of those things are very important, as is decisiveness. To lead is to decide. Prime Ministers often have to be good butchers and cut off the careers of friends and supporters if they're simply not up to the job. And I think all of the greatest Prime Ministers this century have been very good at coming down on one side or the other of an issue.
Ben Pimlott?
Well, I think there is no single quality, and I think if you look at Prime Ministers in this century, you find a huge range of personalities, from people who are very extrovert, very good speakers, to people who are very introverted and, in some cases, rather bad speakers. So I think that the qualities are, in a sense, the range of all available virtues. But I think if one is pinpointing a couple of things, one would be a strong nerve, which is, I think, linked to an ability to enjoy the job even under pressure. And the second, and probably the most critical of all, is being a good judge of people. Possibly the most important job of a Prime Minister is to appoint the best people around him or her, both in terms of the cabinet but also other posts as well. And I think that is critical. And if you look at the really successful prime ministers, they've often been inspired in their judgment of others.
So those are the qualities my guests will be looking for in deciding who is the greatest Prime Minister of the century. By a neat symmetry, there have been 20 Prime Ministers in the 20th century, 12 Conservatives, 3 Liberals and 5 Labour. Before we begin our detailed assessment of the men and one woman who took us from the reign of Queen Victoria to the cusp of a new millennium, here's an abridged history of the residents of Number 10. As the 20th century dawned, the Prime Minister was the Conservative Lord Salisbury. He ruled the British Empire at its zenith and went to war with the Boers. His great-great-grandson, Viscount Cranborne, is unsurprisingly a fan.
He was a great Prime Minister above all because he understood what would avoid a general European conflagration. I think there's a strong case for arguing that if Salisbury had remained in office and at the height of his personal powers, he would have managed to have avoided the First World War.
Salisbury fixed the succession for his nephew Arthur Balfour. Unable to control Tory divisions between free traders and protectionists, he led his party to what was its worst defeat of the century until 1997. The Liberal Prime Minister, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, won a landslide in 1906, but died too soon to see its fruits. His successor, Herbert Henry Asquith, curbed the powers of the House of Lords and laid the foundations of the welfare state by introducing state pensions.
Our new liabilities arise from the grant of pensions and from our determination to supplement and extend this first instalment in a large policy of social reform.
That People's Budget was introduced by the Chancellor, David Lloyd George, who supplanted Asquith as Prime Minister midway through World War I.
It was altogether a dark and well-nigh desperate prospect at the end of 1916. There was a general and well-founded feeling that a more vigorous and effective prosecution of the war was essential.
Lloyd George won the war, partitioned Ireland, turned the honours system into an auction and smashed his party. He was overturned by the Conservative Andrew Bonar Law. The unknown Prime Minister was at Number 10 for just 209 days, during which he was dying of cancer. Stanley Baldwin, 3 times Prime Minister, was the dominant figure of the 20s and most of the 30s. With safety first as his slogan, he managed the general strike and the abdication of Edward VIII. Ramsay MacDonald, Labour's first Prime Minister, stuck to economic orthodoxy in the face of the Great Depression, and the bulk of his party broke from him when he formed a national government with the Tories.
There are people who pant for a return to the gay, high old times of partisan fighting. Our days are too grim for that.
Neville Chamberlain, Conservative Prime Minister from 1937, was initially hugely popular for appeasing Hitler's Germany. Crowds lined the streets of London to cheer his promise of peace in our time.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
After the fall of Norway in 1940, Chamberlain surrendered Number 10. Winston Churchill, who'd been summoned from the wilderness, now inspired and marshalled his country in its darkest hour.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Though Churchill led Britain to victory, in 1945 the voters decided they wanted Labour to shape the peace. Clement Attlee chaired a cabinet of large talents, which nationalised major industries and established the welfare state. In 1948, founding the National Health Service.
Our hospital system, which has grown up in a haphazard way, will from tomorrow become one great service. Here then is our new scheme. I believe that it will increase the health and happiness of our people.
In 1951, the Tories were back, first under Churchill, then Sir Anthony Eden.
Forces are massing for a landing in the Suez Canal zone, but meanwhile the air assault goes on.
Eden's six-day invasion of Egypt ended in humiliating withdrawal. His replacement, Harold Macmillan, ensured that the growing consumerist middle classes had never had it so good. But by 1963, Supermac was debilitated by the Profumo affair and unwell. He gave way to Sir Alec Douglas-Hume. The last Earl to become Prime Minister, he had less than a year in number 10 before Labour returned to power under Harold Wilson. His 60s government heralded a sweeping programme of social liberalisation. He was defeated in his attempts to reform industrial relations, and his economic ambitions were blown off course by devaluation of the pound. He was never allowed to forget this.
Tonight we must face a new situation. From now on, the pound abroad is worth 14% or so less in terms of other currencies. That doesn't mean, of course, that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse or in your bank, has been devalued.
Edward Heath, Conservative Prime Minister from 1970, finally took Britain into the common market.
This ceremony today marks an end and also a beginning. An end to divisions, a beginning of another stage in the construction of a new, united Europe.
What he couldn't unite was his own country. With the miners on strike, the three-day week and the lights going out, Heath called an election in 1974, asking who governs Britain. The voters decided, not you, Mr. Heath. Harold Wilson, after 2 further years in power, retired for an older man, Jim Callaghan. His crisis-racked government was brought to its lowest point by the strikes of the Winter of Discontent. Britain's first female Prime Minister came to office in 1979 and revelled in the sobriquet Iron Lady.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
3 times an election winner, Margaret Thatcher gave the world privatisation, crushed enemies within and without. Her imperious style of governing and the poll tax finally exhausted even Tory MPs, who defenestrated her in 1990. John Major won a surprise 4th Tory victory, but thereafter his government disintegrated amid sleaze and splits over Europe, so awful that in 1995 he challenged his rebels to come and get him.
The Conservative Party must make its choice. Every leader is leader only with the support of his party. In short, it is time to put up or shut up.
Major clung on only to lead his party to its worst defeat in over 100 years in 1997. Tony Blair became the 20th Prime Minister of the 20th century, but we'll come to him later. It's too early in his rule to make a sensible judgment in our survey, though that won't stop us discussing him after the result of our poll later in the programme. I want to work upwards, if you like. So let's begin with who we consider to be the worst Prime Minister of the century. Barbara Castle, who do you think was the worst?
Oh dear, there's so many competitors for the epithet. It's not fair to make us choose. I could give you 5 as a start. But if you insist, it's a sort of toss-up between Anthony Eden and Ramsay MacDonald, I think. Because they were weak men who sort of only made their only decisive gesture in the wrong cause, and a very disastrous cause. I've been listening to Kate Skill's wonderful broadcast about the height of Suez, and he undoubtedly helped force Eden to resign. He was a weak man, all right, he was a sick man, but he was also innately a dandy politically. And then, of course, Ramsay Mac had a disastrous record of nearly destroying the Labour Party, also the national economy. He, after all, presided over a government which allowed Philip Snowden to introduce the most austere and antisocial regime of any Prime Minister.
OK, so there we have Anthony Eden and Ramsay MacDonald nominated by Barbara as two of the worst. Kenneth Baker, who would you add to that list?
I would reinforce Anthony Eden. He was a weak man playing out of character. He was a sheep in wolf's clothing, and that became very evident. I would add to Ramsay MacDonald Neville Chamberlain. There's been a great effort to re-establish Neville Chamberlain. MacLeod wrote a biography on him, and he was a good chancellor in the 30s, but he made the fatal decision, the fatal misjudgment of Hitler, and he was the major appeaser. So I'd have Neville Chamberlain down there as well. I don't rate Balfour very highly, not because he led us to a Conservative Party to colossal defeat, but he wasn't up to much. Kipling was very hard on Balfour. In prose, Kipling referred to Balfour as arid, aloof, incurious, unthinking, unthanking gelt. It's a damning word, gelt. And Balfour's only first book was In Defence of Philosophic Doubt. And Kipling did a poem, "The foundations of philosophic doubt are based on this single premise. Shall we be able to get out to Wimbledon in time for tennis?" He was a trivial Prime Minister, in my view. So those are my four bottom ones.
Ben Pimlott.
I didn't know I was allowed four.
Well, I have two candidates. I mean, I think that the key question with the Prime Minister is not so much what they were like, but the actual effects that they had on the country in the short run and the long run. Certainly, I agree with Kenneth Baker about Neville Chamberlain, who was in many ways a good politician, but the wrong man at the wrong time. The other one, very clearly in my mind, is Margaret Thatcher.
As a failure?
As a failure. After all, if one's judgment is impact, it seems to me that on two very clear counts she was a failure. First of all, her economic policy was disastrous and did very, very severe damage to manufacturing industry at the end of the 1970s, early 1980s. But secondly, she destroyed her own party, and I think that is something which we're feeling the effects of now in a very damaging way. We have a government which is without an opposition, and this situation may last for a very considerable period of time. And this was, to a large extent, to do with her own egomania, her own uncompromising nature. And I think the history will have a very harsh judgment on the Thatcher period.
Let's give Andrew Roberts the opportunity to reply to that, because I think he might have a slightly different perspective on both Margaret Thatcher and which Conservatives he regards as a failure.
Well, I'd put Margaret Thatcher down as a success rather than a failure, and I wouldn't blame her for destroying the Conservative Party at all, but instead John Major, who I have put down as a failure. I think his victory in the 1992 general election can largely be put down to Margaret Thatcher, and also that he was up against Neil Kinnock. I think winning elections is quite an important part of being a successful Prime Minister, which is why I've also got Ted Heath down as a failure in that he lost 3 out of 4. And also I agree with Kenneth that Balfour has to be put down. Balfour was quite good in other jobs than Prime Minister, but if we're choosing him just as a Prime Minister itself, he also, rather like Major, tried to straddle both sides of a crucial issue that went to the heart of the sense of Britain as a nation, and failed to do that.
Just on the John Major point, though, John Major did win an election which he wasn't supposed to win, and it could be said he actually consolidated the achievements of Margaret Thatcher, what you regard as achievements, and Tony Blair, for instance, would not exist without John Major's election victory in 1992, would he?
Well, I would put that down to the greatness of Margaret Thatcher rather than the success of Major, who then, we must remember, went down to the greatest failure, a disastrous defeat of the century.
Roy Jenkins, Andrew Roberts had Ted Heath as one of his failures. Do you think that's entirely fair to Ted Heath?
No, I think Ted Heath was overall not a very good Prime Minister, because he didn't have great tact or antennae, but he did achieve one thing, which had eluded his predecessors. He got Britain into Europe, and I think that made as much difference to the future of the country as Peel's reform of the Corn Laws did in the 19th century. He was a man who did one good thing, I think good, but whether you think it good or not, it was an important and decisive thing. But in the surroundings wasn't all that good. Now, I feel I'm much the most charitable person here. I'm being forced into doing great defences of these malign Prime Ministers. I start with Barbara and Ramsay MacDonald. Ramsay MacDonald, of course, I was brought up to believe, was absolutely awful from 1931 onwards. But he had propelled the Labour Party into being a party of government during the 1920s far more quickly than anybody else would. You've got two minority governments that were inconceivable at the beginning of the 20s, at the end of the war. And although Arthur Henderson was a much more worthy figure, I bet he wouldn't have got the Labour Party as a party of government as quickly as Ramsay MacDonald did. Balfour, I don't think I'll bother to defend Balfour. Though as an individual, as a personality, he was rather better than Kipling found him. I mean, most people enjoyed sitting next to Balfour more than they did sitting next to Kipling, but that's not perhaps the most
criteria.
That's not good enough,
that's not right. Anyway, I think what I better do is to come to my failures, and the people I would regard as some failures who've got to go different ways. Who did most harm to the country? Well, probably Neville Chamberlain did. But Neville Chamberlain, when he became Prime Minister, was thought to greatly improve the tone of the Cabinet, conducted much more tautly. And he did have certain achievements on the home social front during the 1920s. But my list of failures would be, as Prime Minister, Bonner Law, though it was a sad, dismal 6 months, not entirely his own fault. He was never an inspiring figure.
He was ill.
But he had been a rather, well, he wasn't diagnosed until the end, but maybe he was always ill. He'd been quite a good Martha to Lloyd George's Mary during the wartime coalition. That, I think, is about best to be said there. But I would certainly write him down as a failure. Eden, I think, too, although Eden had been, on the whole, good, not invariably so, a Foreign Secretary during his 3 periods as Foreign Secretary. And I think Major must be written down as a failure as Prime Minister. Indeed, as he occupied previous offices very briefly, a political failure. I think he's a nice and decent man.
I'd agree. The joining the common market in '72 is an enduring thing that survives. But I was the most junior minister in Ted Heath's government from '72 to '74, and it was a disaster. It was an appalling. Everything went wrong. Prices and incomes policy, and Ted failed the country very badly then. On Roy's business of sitting next to the Prime Minister, you'd like to sit next to, the one you most liked to sit next to was Asquith. And I remember my history tutor at Oxford saying, when Asquith came and spoke in the 1920s, and they were given dinner at the Union, and the tray of brandy was brought round, at the time that it took one student to take 1 glass of brandy off and put beside him, Asquith had taken one and drunk it, taken a second and poured into his coffee, and taken a third to drink later.
Okay. I'm just struck, well, before we come back, I'm just struck by one name missing from your lists of failures, perhaps because you're all too kind Prime Ministers who former Prime Minister still living, and that's Jim Callaghan, who, after all, had the country running off to the International Monetary Fund, presided over the winter of discontent, and lost an election, which meant the Conservatives were then in power for 18 years. Barbara, the man sacked you. I'm surprised he wasn't on your list.
I know, and I would have put him in one of my 4 if I'd been told that I could have 4 and not 1. No, I think Callaghan was a disaster. Not only because he got rid of me, but the moment he tried to get rid of child benefit, which I just introduced. So that is one of my main grievances against him, because he was frightened of the trade unions, you know. I remember him arguing against child benefit in Cabinet, saying, well, you see that unions will never put up with having a deduction made from their wage packet to give to the wife. He was a terrible old right-winger, he really was. And then, of course, his mad misjudgment about inflation and the fact that over the incomes policy, trying to get 5% incomes norm when you've got 10% inflation.
Okay, but I think you made the case for Jim Callaghan being a failure. Let's move on. Enoch Power once said that all political careers end in failure, but let's try and look at now some of the middle rankers of the 20th century, people we think did all right at number 10. Kenneth Baker.
Middle rankers, Lord Salisbury. I don't rate him as highly as Andrew Roberts, who's just published a brilliant biography, by the way, which has been reviewed by Roy Jenkins and others. But I think Salisbury gets there largely for his work in the 19th century. In the 20th century, he has to answer for getting us into the Boer War. The other middle rankers, I would put Campbell Bannerman as middle ranker. Again, he was there for such a short time, it was quite difficult to make a judgment of him, really. Slightly above the middle rankers, I would put Asquith and Macmillan. I put Macmillan very high for pure style, and also for leading the Tory party back from complete collapse. Ben was saying earlier that one of the things that he would hold against Thatcher was he destroyed the Conservative Party. I remember in 1957, after Suez, the belief that the Tory party was finished forever. We would never hold government again in this century because we'd done so badly. It was absolutely the end of the Tory party. Macmillan showed that, in fact, within 2 years, he could take the Tory party back to victory.
Well, I don't know how to respond to that. It's sad to say that the period was much shorter, wasn't it? I mean, there was a big dip after 1956, yeah. But the current dip is much more protracted, I think, much more serious, not in the same category.
Roy Jenkins, who do you think had an average sort of innings?
To some extent, but not entirely. I agree with Kenneth Baker. My list of average would be Balfour, Campbell Bannerman. Ramsay MacDonald I would put as average, and I'd put Harold Wilson certainly, and I think I'd just put Jim Callaghan into that category too.
Ben Pimlott, Roy Jenkins thinks Harold Wilson was only average, though he did win 4 out of 5 elections. Do you rate Harold Wilson a bit more highly than that?
I would rate Harold Wilson as being above average, and I think that by the criterion of the impact of a period of office on the country, I think as we get further away from the 1960s, some of the endemic problems of that period shade into other periods as well in terms of economic policy. But I think one also does see that period, and Roy Jenkins, of course, was very instrumental in bringing this about, an extraordinary shift in the liberalism, if one could put it that way, of Britain, and a whole range of issues on which legislative reform took place and what wasn't able to take place by the existence of a Labour government which had to get elected. Talk about Ramsay MacDonald making the Labour Party part of government. Surely the party leader of the century has made the Labour Party part of government apart from Tony Blair. Was Harold Wilson. I mean, he won 4 elections.
Well, indeed, Barbara Castle, Harold Wilson talked about Labour becoming the natural party of government, though perhaps that was a bit hubristic as things turned out.
Well, I'd put Harold Wilson as one of my successors, because, you see, he was a man of principle who sacrificed himself and his reputation for that principle. He quite deliberately did it. Namely, and his principle was, after the 13 years in the wilderness, after the Bevanite splits and the rest of it, his sacred duty was to hold the party together. And I think Roy would be the first to admit that he did it. If you're an enemy, I remember David Owen saying to me, the one way to get into the cabinet is to attack Harold. He immediately brought his enemies in to keep everything together. And I remember at the time of the Heath terms, the mood of the Labour Party was strongly against accepting those terms in 72. I know Roy helped Heath to get it through and became one of the men that the party execrated as a result. But Harold, you see, it was attacked because he said, people said he really is in favour of going in. He was in favour of going in. And I remember having a private talk to him saying, why don't you listen to some of your friends? And he said, why won't my friends trust me? I know what I'm doing. I am going to oppose Heath's terms. I shall be the most attacked and denigrated man in the British press. I'm going to go through 3 months of hell. But my job is to keep this party together. Now, I mean, he told me that privately. And then, of course, he also went on to tell me that when he had brought the party back into power, he had given a date to the Queen as to when he would retire. He didn't tell me the actual date, but he told me his intentions. He said, I've been 8 years leading this party. What did you say, Roy?
He did tell Roy.
Oh, he told you. Well, he didn't tell me the exact date, but he said, I've been leading this party now for 8 years, and it has been hell. And I want to get the hell out as soon as I've led it to one more victory. Now, there was a man with clear function he'd set himself, and I think it was a noble one.
Well, I agree with some of the things Barbara said. I'm not sure it all adds up to his being a great politician of principle. I agree to the extent that I think Harold Wilson is currently underrated. And I think he was, in some ways, a very good Prime Minister to serve under, because he had good nerve when things were going wrong, which at the time they were, certainly on the economic front. He was instinctively a kind man. He liked being nice to people rather than nasty to people. Perhaps that was one of his weaknesses. But I think he was underestimated. I don't go quite as far as Barbara in saying that, nor, you see, fundamentally do I think, that the view that in all the circumstances you should hold our party together, that is the full criterion.
So are you not then pushing him above average?
I think a lot of people will put him below average.
Yes.
I'm certainly putting him up. I'm putting him up well to average. And if somebody wants to push him a tiny bit further, well,
most of them are
not over my
average,
dead body, certainly.
I think the thing about Wilson at the end of his time, he was asked, what did he really achieve?
Oh, he achieved all the...
He said the Open University.
Listen just a minute. He said the Open University is what I'd like to be remembered by. And I don't think you can judge a Prime Minister purely on his capacity to keep the Labour Party together.
Right, that'll have to be the last word on Harold Wilson. You're listening to the Westminster Hour with Andrew Rawnsley. In this special programme, we're ranking the Prime Ministers of the 20th century, the successes and the failures. The result of our survey of 20 experts is coming up. That'll tell us who's been voted the greatest Prime Minister of the century. And with me in the studio are Barbara Castle, Roy Jenkins, Kenneth Baker, Ben Pimlott and Andrew Roberts. Let's now talk about Prime Ministers we regard as successes. Andrew Roberts, not quite the greatest, but who was a success?
Asquith was a success in laying the basis for the welfare state. Attlee was a success for bringing it into being, and Thatcher was a success for reforming it properly.
Kenneth Baker.
Successes, I put Asquith there, certainly. I put Lloyd George above Asquith. I think Lloyd George was a very important figure in the history of the 20th century. You know, ninepence for fourpence, he did leave a durable thing. But I think the thing about Lloyd George is that his last 4 years was a sheer disgrace. It was a disgrace to public life.
Well, how do you balance this? You see, Lloyd George wins World War I, does a lot of important things,
that's why,
but on the other hand smashes his party.
That's why I don't put him in my first 4 or 5. But it was a poor government. The hard-faced men had done well out of the war. And I remember inviting, when I was at Oxford, Samuel Hoare to come back. I found he was still alive. And he came back and spoke at a dinner. And over dinner I said, what do you think of Lloyd George? And he said, Lloyd George was corrupt, corrupted and corruptible.
Well, so was he, actually. Samuel Hoare he took £2,000 a year from Beaverbrook, or throughout the 1930s.
Great expertise.
Roy Jenkins, who's among your successes?
My success is Attlee, clearly. Salisbury, yes, I think Salisbury was a success. I think Thatcher was a success. I'm bound to put her in this category.
Why? Because she won 3 elections? She changed the world?
Such a long, continuous period, the first woman Prime Minister, and she did leave an imprint upon the country. There's no question about that. I think Macmillan, and less firmly than the other 3, I think Macmillan and Baldwin were successes. I think Baldwin was very considerable interwar Prime Minister. Of course, he didn't get rearmament people right, but Chamberlain bears much more responsibility for appeasement than Baldwin does. And one thing Baldwin did extremely well was he was an assuaging Prime Minister. And he, go with MacDonald if you like, he handled the general strike well, he handled the abdication well, and he also brought the part of the agency for bringing the Labour Party into full position as a senior party of state. And that, I think, avoided conflicts which might otherwise have taken place. Trouble is, he allowed himself under Neville Chamberlain's guidance then to destroy that temporarily by forming the national government in 1931, which I think was a grave error from everybody's point of view, not least Baldwin, because he didn't become Prime Minister again for some time after that.
There is another view of Stanley Baldwin, expressed, for instance, by George Orwell, who called him simply a hole in the air. Barbara, do you agree with Roy that Stanley Baldwin should be one of the successes?
No. I was only a schoolgirl at the time, but I remember having the adults sort of pouring contempt on him over my head. No, my successors, actually, would be Churchill and Attlee, because I think the greatness, the success of a Prime Minister depends very much on whether he's the right chap in the right place at the right time. Now, Churchill undoubtedly was a great wartime leader. I remember I was a terrified air raid warden in the London Blitzers. And at first, when the war was declared and we'd all got the memories of Guernica in our minds, I thought I might cut and run. But he rallied. There's no doubt about that. Now, Attlee was the man at the right moment. Churchill would have been utterly wrong in the post-war situation. Attlee was the right man. He had quiet courage as Attlee. And you see, just because Attlee was the one who made Nye Bevan Minister of Health. We'd never have had the NHS.
I want to pick up on a point you raised there with Ben Pimlott about Clement Attlee, because I wrestled a bit with Attlee. Attlee presides over a great government, but more as a chairman of talents some people would say were larger than himself. Now, does that make you a very successful Prime Minister just because you're a good chairman? Is that enough?
Well, I put Attlee in my top 3, in fact, number 3 after Churchill and Lloyd George. I think it's a very interesting example, precisely of Barbara's point about timing. You know, it was a very good time for someone like that to be Prime Minister. He had a very good collection of colleagues. He was more beleaguered by his close colleagues than I think any other Prime Minister, including well, perhaps not including Harold Wilson, but equal with Harold Wilson. But nevertheless, the results of that period of Prime Ministership were dramatic and sensational, and on those grounds, I think.
He presided over a very effective government, and he held it together. But he was a cox and not a stroke, as it were.
Yeah, but he was a cox.
Deft in that way. But one general point: when you asked can I just say that when you asked us the successes, I thought we were still going on to who you think were the great.
And we are. In fact, we're going to go on to that now. That was a very good cue. Thank you, Roy, because now is our opportunity to say who we think was the greatest Prime Minister of the century. Kenneth Baker.
It was certainly Winston Churchill.
Without argument?
Without any argument. The way he galvanised the country in 1940, he marshalled the English language to fight for the country. He is undoubtedly the greatest. I don't think anybody comes close to him, in fact. Of course there were defects. There are always defects in great people. My number 2 is Margaret Thatcher, not surprisingly, because I think Margaret Thatcher has dominated the last 20 years of this century in a way that very few prime ministers have. I don't agree with Ben that she's destroyed the Tory party. That's an episode yet to come. Well, not to come, I would hope, or you're not to come. But, whatever one thinks about her, and I'm sure around the table there's strong criticism of her, she did actually change the political weather in our country. Going back to my definition at the beginning, the way that she actually ended the grip that the trade union power had. The trade unions, in my time, destroyed 3 prime ministers. Her reorganisation of the whole control economy that Attlee left. I have a high regard for Attlee, by the way, he's my number 3. The privatisation is something that can't be reversed. And the real monument to Margaret Thatcher is, of course, Tony Blair.
OK, I doubt if Barbara Castle agrees with you about Margaret Thatcher. Who's your greatest Prime Minister of the century, Barbara?
Well, if I've got to choose one, which I object to, I must choose Attlee, because undoubtedly he seized the opportunity of victory and the desires of the men and women returning from the forces to revolutionise their whole pattern of thinking and interdependence of people, social unity, all those sort of things, and of course the welfare state, which is still with us, and the National Health Service is the most popular item policy that any government has ever introduced. And so, all right, he may have been a chairman, but the point is, what does that matter? He just kept those together, and many a time he tried to save Nye Bevan from Gaitskill's attacks. He would have perhaps succeeded in ending that split, avoiding that split, if he hadn't been so ill at the end.
Thank you, Barbara. Around this table anyway, so far 1 for Churchill as the greatest, 1 for Attlee. Andrew Roberts.
Winston Churchill, the problems of peace are very important, as Barbara was saying, but the problems of war were far greater. And what he did at the times of Britain's greatest peril this century makes him the greatest. After that, Lloyd George, because of what he did in the Great War, although they were both pretty useless peacetime prime ministers. And then I'm also going to say Lord Salisbury, who brought Britain up to the greatest point from which it's been going downhill for the whole of the rest of the century.
Ben Pimlott, Churchill, in an uncharacteristic moment of modesty, said Britain was the lion, he only provided the roar. Do you think there's more to it than just being a fantastic orator at a time of great danger to his country? Or could Britain not have been saved by anybody else but Churchill?
I don't know about that. It's very difficult to know what would have happened. But I mean, I think it's much more than just the roar, though. What a roar, as your quotation showed. No, I think if you read what was written at the time, within days of him becoming Prime Minister, the whole situation had altered psychologically. There'd been a kind of galvanising of everybody at every level, and at the highest level particularly. I think that Churchill clearly stands head and shoulders above any of the competition. I would put Lloyd George a second, rather for the reasons that Andrew did, but I think Churchill is clearly preeminent.
Roy Jenkins, was Winston Churchill, I mean, was it slightly a product of time and chance that he ended up being greatest? Many people think, had there been an election in 1940, were it not for Adolf Hitler, Churchill might not even have been in the House of Commons anymore.
It's perfectly possible, but I would certainly put him as the greatest, and fairly clearly the greatest. I think his prime ministerial contribution was very concentrated on the 2 years of 1940 and 1941. Because those were 2 crucial years in the history of the country. Whether we would have resisted under somebody else, I don't know. But I think Churchill also comes up because he was much the most fascinating human being. The sheer exuberance, the energy, his many-faceted activities and work over his whole career, marred by many misjudgments, several failures, not always a very good judge of men, but just as a unique human being, I think he stands head and shoulders above everybody else.
So around this table we have a large majority for Winston Churchill as the Titan of the century. Is that the verdict of our whole electorate? Our returning officer is Peter Donaldson.
We polled 20 leading experts to find out who they rated as the greatest British Prime Minister of the 20th century. Our panel included 9 professors, biographers of leaders from the turn of the century to the 90s, and politicians with a total of over 200 years' experience in Parliament between them. We asked them to rank the 19 Prime Ministers from Salisbury to Major, and this is how they voted. In 19th place, the Prime Minister of Suez, Sir Anthony Eden. In 18th, the Prime Minister of Munich, Neville Chamberlain. 17th, the last Conservative Prime Minister of the century, the loser in its biggest election defeat, John Major. In 16th place, the Conservative A.J. Balfour, who lost heavily to the Liberals in 1906. 15th, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, the Earl who became an MP to become PM. In 14th, the first Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, who turned against his party. In 13th, just 7 months at number 10 after the First World War, the Conservative Andrew Bonar Law. 12th place goes to Labour's Prime Minister from the 70s, James Callaghan. Ranked at 11, it's the man who took Britain into the common market, Edward Heath. Our top 10 Prime Ministers of the century starts at number 10, where else? With Heath's perpetual rival, Labour's Harold Wilson. At 9, the first Liberal in Downing Street this century, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman. 8th place goes to the Tories' interwar leader, Stanley Baldwin. In 7th, the century's first Prime Minister, but the last peer to run the country, the Marquis of Salisbury. And in 6th place, Supermac, the Conservative who told us we'd never had it so good, Harold Macmillan. Our final 5. First of all, in 5th place, the century's longest surviving and first woman Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. 4th, it's the Liberal Herbert Henry Asquith, who led Britain as the First World War approached and began. In 3rd position, the wartime deputy who became a peacetime Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. 2nd is one of the century's most controversial leaders, the last Liberal Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. But the century's greatest Prime Minister voted so in the Westminster Hour's poll of 20 leading experts, the Prime Minister from the Second World War, Winston Churchill.
So the verdict of our wider poll was pretty similar to our verdict around the table here. The bottom 3, John Major, Neville Chamberlain, and Sir Anthony Eden, the worst Prime Minister of the century, and the top 3, Clement Attlee, David Lloyd George, and Winston Churchill, the greatest Prime Minister of the century in our survey. Now, so far we've deliberately not talked about the last Prime Minister of this century and presumably the first Prime Minister of the next century, Tony Blair. Let's now consider, Kenneth Baker, beginning with you, where Tony Blair so far is looking in these rankings.
Well, it's very difficult after 2 years for the muse of history to make any sort of assessment. But I would have thought that Blair will certainly be remembered, not only for his great victory, but also for the change he's made constitutionally to the country, which had not been thought through and are at the beginning stages. And I think that if you're distancing yourself 10 or 15 years out, the changes in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and in experimenting with proportional representation are so fundamental to the constitutional fabric of our society and our society in general. Some of them would have happened in spite of Blair, but I think Blair's pushing it all the time to make it happen.
But that means, perhaps, if irreversibility is one of the tests of the legacy of Prime Ministers, Ben Pimlott, that means Tony Blair has already got a legacy which probably cannot be reversed by anybody.
I think that's right. I find myself very much in agreement with what Kenneth Baker has said. It is very early days. Blair may well be one of the Prime Ministers who lasts for 10 years or longer. He's the youngest of the century. But it's, I think, impossible not to say that he's had a good start, both in the sense that he's maintained the popularity of his party in an extraordinary way. But I think there is a feeling that although there have been some casualties around him, that he's kept a very steady hand on the tiller. I have this view that every Prime Minister has their equivalent of the Falklands crisis at some stage, in which, in fact, that's one thing Margaret Thatcher in the end got right, though she shouldn't have stumbled into it in the first place. But about 2 or 3 years in, there's something crops up which is really testing. And if they get it right, and if they get it dramatically right, then they're made. And if they don't, then they never really recover.
And do you think he's had that in the Kosovo War, or it's not happened
I
yet?
think it nearly happened in the Kosovo War, but in the end, it was not our war, it was the Americans' war. But I think it was borderline. But I think, in a sense, it hasn't yet happened, and we can't properly judge him until it has. And I think we must watch this space for the next couple of years.
That big testing moment that will define him. Barbara Castle, where do you rate Tony Blair at the moment?
Well, I don't like rating a man after 2 years. I think it's darned unfair.
Though it's longer than some of these prime ministers we've been considering.
Well, maybe, and we couldn't judge them by their short record. I would rather agree with Ben Pimlott. I think the jury in some areas is out still. I think he made a good start. I think he could go either way. And I'm waiting for that decisive moment that Ben
What would you
mentioned.
mark him down on, Barbara?
I'm particularly expert in the pensions and welfare field, and he has declared war on child poverty, and in doing so, he's given the biggest increase, at least for the first child, that child benefits ever had since we introduced it. But on the other hand, he's sought systematically to destroy state insurance. Now, there's some contradictions there. That's why I say the jury's out, and I'm waiting to see which way he finally goes.
Andrew Roberts, obviously temporarily, but where at the moment do you rate Tony Blair?
I think he's quite high up. He's sort of 9 or 10. He's got a good chance, especially if he stays in power for 10 years or longer, which he very easily could, to be up there in the top 7. He's taken lots of risks, opened a lot of Pandora's boxes. If it turns out that it all goes wrong, he will go down as one of the great wreckers of British history. But actually, he's
Why
got
a
very
wrecker?
well, because of the constitutional changes that he's put into place. If they actually start to break up the United Kingdom, for example, he could go down as one of the great wreckers of history. But if he's successful, there's everything to play for here.
I think that he's working very much within the Thatcher parameters. I don't think he's changed very much from over the last 15 years. He's not reversed privatisation. He's kept a tight control on expenditure. It's very much a question of MacDonald and Child.
Roy Jenkins, where are you rating Tony Blair?
I agree with Barbara. It's very difficult to judge after 2.5 years what he looked like in history. But if one goes back to my original criteria, which you asked for at the beginning, longevity in office, well, he shows so far every sign of having a very good chance of having a really long period in office. Secondly, a dominant person in his government, both in the perception of the public and of his colleagues. He clearly qualifies well there. The third one, is he likely, work of his government likely to lead a lasting impact on the country and on the direction of the country? Well, Kenneth Baker produced a powerful argument about the constitutional thing. I think it's early days to judge that, but very likely so. I think there's an interesting further question which arises in my mind. It's an odd paradox that all the great left of centre reforming prime ministers, going just back a little for one into the 19th century, Gladstone, Asquith, Attlee, were all men of profoundly conservative habits of mind, conservative with a small c, except for politics. But on politics, they stuck to them and carried them forward. Now, I'm not sure whether Tony Blair falls into this category of a man, a determined radical on the political front, but liking very established values on every other front. I'm not sure.
I think full marks for him, too, in the sheer strength of character. He's carrying his government. You know, he is it. If he suddenly disappeared, this government becomes very, very much weaker. He really is dominating it in the way that Roy says.
Well, on that reasonably encouraging note for Tony Blair, my thanks to Barbara Castle, Roy Jenkins, Kenneth Baker, Ben Pimlott and Andrew Roberts. Winston Churchill was the greatest Prime Minister of the 20th century. And if you'd like to have your say, you can join the debate on the BBC's website at www.bbc.co.uk/news. Go to the UK politics section where you can hear the whole programme and add your own comments. Next week, it's just possible that I may be talking to a leader of the future. On the first Sunday of the new millennium, we've asked the three main parties to put up what they regard as the brightest and the best of the coming generation of politicians. All under 25, I'll be asking them to identify the big issues and battle lines of the 21st century. Will global capitalism be challenged by environmentalism? Will the nation-state fade away, or will nationalism be resurgent in new and dangerous ways? Will politics be enslaved to science, or be the master of it? Just some of the questions we'll be exploring with some of the people who might have to answer them. Until next Sunday, January the 2nd, the year 2000. From me, Andrew Rawnsley, and all of us here at the Westminster Hour, a very good evening and a happy new century.